So in today's video, we're going to take a look at the image quality of the Fujifilm X-T5 and compare that to the image quality of the Fujifilm GFX 50S2. And before we take a look at some shots here, just want to say a few things. So, obviously this is not a fair comparison at all. I mean, we're looking at a 40 megapixel APS-C sensor versus a 50 megapixel medium format sensor. So, definitely not an apples to apples comparison at all. There's a huge difference here between the sensor size, big difference between the cost of the cameras, the cost of the lenses, all that kind of stuff. But anyways, let's go ahead, have some fun, and take a look at some shots. So here in Lightroom, I have a bunch of landscape shots that I captured with the X-T5 and the GFX 50S2. And we'll do some side-by-side comparisons. We'll look at the image quality. We'll take a look at the ISO performance between these two cameras, as well as dynamic range. But yeah, let's go ahead. We'll just jump into the first comparison here. It'll be this shot right here. And right away, you can notice there's an aspect ratio difference. So the X-T5 has a 3:2 aspect ratio. The GFX has a 4:3 aspect ratio. That's why it looks a little bit more squarish here. And the other thing I want to note here, when we're looking at things on a global level like this, it's really going to be hard to see any noticeable difference at all. If you take a look here, so this area where the X-T5 image is, so that's about a little over 4 megapixels of area on my computer monitor. And then the GFX image here, this is a little bit bigger. It's about 4.5 megapixels of area on my computer monitor. So when you take a 40 megapixel image of this X-T5 and a 50 megapixel image of the GFX, and you look at them at 4 and 4.5 megapixels, there's just not going to be much of a noticeable difference. So what I like to do is just zoom into 100%, and that way we have a 1-to-1 pixel ratio between the images and the computer monitor, and that way we can actually see differences between the images. So we'll go ahead and take a look here. Now I want to focus in on this area to the right of the waterfall. So I'm just going to drag this over here, and you can just see there is a pretty big difference in the level of detail here on the GFX and all of these rocks and cracks compared to the X-T5 here. Now obviously the lens is going to have a lot to do with the image quality, but I am using a pretty good lens on the X-T5 in this shot. It's the 16 to 55 millimeter f2.8 lens. And then the GFX, I'm using the 45 to 100 millimeter lens. But regardless of that, there's just quite a big difference here in the level of detail, as well as the color and the tonality here. I mean, this isn't necessarily like a very colorful image, but I'm just seeing it's a bit more of a richness to the GFX file for sure. And then the other thing I want to note here as well is these are all raw files, so I haven't edited these at all. Then the other comparison I wanted to do with this composition, so I have a downscaled GFX image, so this is just downscaled to 40 megapixels, exported as a TIFF. And we'll just kind of look at these side by side here, and just notice how much crisper the GFX is compared to the X-T5. Now I would say, if you're looking at the X-T5 on its own, like we are right here, it looks great. It looks very detailed. There's a ton of sharpness. Everything looks good. The color, everything. To me, the X-T5 does produce a beautiful image, but it's just when you compare it to something at a higher level, like the GFX, there is definitely a difference in the image quality here. I can just see a lot more detail in the walls here of the canyon compared to the X-T5. So let's go ahead, we'll move on to another comparison shot here. And so for this shot, I focused kind of on these trees over here on this ridge. So let's go ahead and actually sync that up first. I'm just kind of looking right now at this tree right here. So I just want to drag these trees over. And again, it's kind of a similar thing where I'm just seeing a lot more detail in the GFX file. It's just more sharp. Again, you know, the lens is going to have a lot to do with it. So in this case, I was using the 70 to 300 millimeter lens for the X-T5, and then the 100 to 200 millimeter lens for the GFX. But even just looking, let's kind of look at this peak here in the back. There's just more richness to this file, more clarity. If you look at these rocks down here versus over here, just everything just looks a lot better on the GFX. But again, if we were to just only look at the X-T5 by itself, I mean, it looks great. There's a ton of detail. Everything looks really nice. Nothing to complain about at all. But then you do that comparison, and it's just, you can see that there is a level beyond. And the GFX definitely goes to that level. You just see a lot more detail and crispness there. And then I also have another downscaled image. So let's go ahead. This is another one that's downscaled to 40 megapixels. Just want to see what that looks like. And you know, there's really no difference between the comparison with the 50 megapixel image and the 40. It's kind of still the same story here. You just get a much more beautiful file out of the GFX, which, you know, it's kind of expected. I mean, it's a bigger sensor, more expensive, all that kind of stuff. So, all right, let's go ahead. We'll move on. We'll do some ISO comparisons now. And we have this composition here in the mountains. And so for this shot on the X-T5, I used the 16 to 55 millimeter lens. And on the GFX, this is the 45 to 100 millimeter lens. And so for these shots here, I focused kind of at this area right in here. And so that's where we'll kind of start out to take a look here. And these are both at the base ISO. So the X-T5 is base ISO 125. The GFX is base ISO is 100. And again, you know, you can notice that difference in detail and just richness of the file. But in terms of the noise, there's really not a huge difference here at ISO 125 versus ISO 100 at their, you know, base ISOs. Everything looks really good in both of those. Let's move up to ISO 200, and we'll start over here. And yeah, in terms of noise, it's, you know, both are performing really good here. Not seeing a huge difference in terms of noise. I mean, I am seeing that, you know, difference in terms of the actual image quality as far as sharpness and tonality and everything. Let's go ahead, we'll move up to ISO 400. Look at some of these trees down in here. Now I'm starting to see a little bit more noise in the X-T5, but it still looks pretty clean here. Whereas the GFX is just really clean at ISO 400. Let's keep moving up here. Really nothing exciting at these lower ISO values. So now we'll take a look at ISO 800. Definitely seeing a little bit more noise in the X-T5. Let's look at some of these areas over here. Still not a huge difference between the two. I can definitely see that the GFX is a little bit cleaner, for sure, but not by a whole ton here at ISO 800. Let's go ahead and bump up to ISO 1600 here. Alright, yep, definitely seeing more noise now in the X-T5. It's a lot more noticeable. Oh, it was raining a little bit here on this the day I took these shots, so that's just a drop of rain on my lens there. But in terms of just the noise here, it's becoming quite a bit more noticeable on the X-T5 versus the GFX. GFX is still looking very, very clean. Look in these trees over in here versus over here. Maybe pull this in a little bit. And you can see the color just looks better in the GFX as well. It's kind of retaining that color information better. You kind of look up in this area versus here, and you can just see the huge detail difference there, but even the noise difference is starting to become a little bit more significant now at ISO 1600. Alright, let's go ahead, we'll bump it up to ISO 3200 here. And yeah, now the difference is becoming bigger now. Seeing a lot more noise here on the X-T5. Like look in this area right in here versus over here on the GFX. I mean, I'm definitely seeing a little bit of noise in here on the GFX, but it's looking a lot cleaner than the X-T5. Alright, now I do have another composition that I shot at ISO 3200. Just wanted to kind of give another example here. So let's look at this shot here, and we can take a look at some of these darker areas in here. You can just see quite a bit more noise in the X-T5 image versus the GFX. Same thing if you look up here in the sky. Now there is some noise up here on the GFX, but it just definitely looks quite a bit cleaner than the X-T5. Let's kind of look at some other areas here. Look into the town. Just see a lot more graininess to the image. All right, let's go ahead now. We'll bump it up to ISO 64. Take a look in here. So look at this. So there's a pretty big difference here now. And there's already a pretty big difference before ISO 3200, but that difference is just widening. It's just getting bigger. If you look at all this noise here, I mean, there's still a decent amount of noise over here as well, but it's just so much better controlled on the GFX. So shooting at a higher ISO, you're just going to get a much cleaner image on the GFX versus the X-T5. Let's look over here a little bit. Get all this noise. Even some looks like color noise over in here. But yeah, just the colors of the image are just being retained a lot better with that GFX file as well. And we'll look at this other composition at ISO 6400 as well. Let's go ahead, take a look here. So just look at all this noise over here on the X-T5 compared over here. Just a pretty big difference there. Yeah. Especially you can really tell up in the sky here. Very noisy. All right. One thing I actually want to do as well is on ISO 6400, let's take a look at the base ISO of each versus ISO 6400. So we're looking at two X-T5 files now. So we have the base ISO on the left and then ISO 6400 on the right. So just look at that difference. So it's really clean, like hardly any noise at all here at the base ISO, and then you look at ISO 6400. night and day difference here in terms of the noise. Let's do the same thing with the GFX file. Look at ISO 100 versus ISO 6400. And yeah, there's a pretty big difference here as well. If you look at that, you definitely see a lot more green on the ISO 6400 shot, but it definitely is just not as bad as the X-T5. Still looks a lot cleaner. All right, let's go ahead and let's take a look at ISO 12,800 now. And you know, both of these images are very, very noisy, but again, the X-T5 is a lot noisier here. And if you look at this, like back in here, this peak, you can't make out hardly any of this detail here, whereas on the GFX you can still make out quite a lot. So the noise isn't really destroying the image as much. It's not breaking the image down as much. I mean, they're both still very noisy. There's a huge water drop there. But yeah, I mean, they're both very noisy, but the GFX definitely is performing a lot better, which is expected. All right, and then I have this other shot. We'll look at this with 12,800 as well. And we'll take a look over here. Yep, you can just see quite a bit more noise on the X-T5. All over the image here. All right, so next I want to look at these next set of images here. So these are all just underexposed. So this one is underexposed by 3 stops. So what I want to do here is just raise the exposure by 3 stops, and then also bring the highlights down all the way to bring back some of that highlight information there in the sky. And then what I'll do is just copy those settings, and then we'll paste it into the GFX file here, and then we'll compare. So again, these are boosted by 3 stops, and give it a second to load here. There we go. Let's bring this down, and here's the difference here. Definitely seeing a lot more noise in the X-T5, but they both look all right. I think they both handle that adjustment pretty well, actually. The 3-stop exposure boost, and that's a pretty big boost. You know, but yeah, the GFX is definitely handling it a little bit better. Oh boy, here's a huge water drop right here. All right. And then I have this other set, or these other 2 images. So this one is underexposed by 5 stops now. So let me go ahead, bump that up by 5 stops. We'll do the same thing, just bring the highlights down. And copy that and paste it in here. Do our comparison. Let it load. Yeah, so there's definitely a much bigger difference now. So the X-T5 file is falling apart quite a bit, or at least quite a bit more than the GFX file. You can kind of see that all over the place. Look back in here. A pretty big difference here. All right, well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. So I'd be pretty interested to see what you guys thought about these results. So, let me know in the comments below what you thought. And, make sure you are subscribed to the channel, and I will see you on the next video.